Good morning, friends, and welcome to another episode of PB Reads the Bible. Good morning, good morning. I'm PB. I'm Pastor Brian, pastor here at Christ United Methodist Church in Waynesboro, and it is wonderful to be together on this day. Today is Thursday, July 14th, and it is 9 o'clock for me. And for you, if you're joining me live, although I know some of you folks aren't able to, excuse me, aren't able to join with us live, so you're watching the recording. That's also wonderful that you're doing that you're finding out the time. As we've been going through this, we've been making our way through the Bible. Today we're starting a new book of the Bible. At least the way the Christian Bible is put together, it's a different book than we were doing. We're looking at 2 Samuel. So today is episode 1 on our journey through 2 Samuel. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And what I mean by all that. Because if you're joining us only for the first time, you're not going to have any idea what I'm talking about. So I'm going to explain it to you. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. So glad to have you with us today. And if you're not joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so glad you're joining us today. This is wonderful. Now, what I would ask is that you check in. Let me know that you're there, who it is, because all I see is a number of people, and I love to know who it is. And you can do that on Facebook and YouTube. You can also send me a text, 570-351-1619. Same goes for any questions or comments you might have as we go along today. Or whatever day it is you're watching it. And you can put those in there, because even if you're not watching live, I go back into the streams a few times over a period of the day or the next couple days to see if there are any questions or comments that I want to address. So I see some folks are checking in. You're doing your romper room roll call. Good morning, Cheryl. Good to have you with us. Excited to begin the rest of the journey. Awesome. So am I. Good morning, Ron. Good to have you joining us, being together with us this morning. This is wonderful. Great stuff. Love that you folks, again, I love that you folks join me for this. I really do. It means a lot, and it's very humbling. It's very humbling that you do that. Oh, another one. Good morning, Maureen. Sunny morning and didn't have rain again. Hi, everyone. Good morning. We got enough rain the other day. Whew, that's for sure. Although we probably still need it. It's just that came down so heavy here in the Waynesboro area the other day. I don't think the folks up in NEPA got that rain on Tuesday, but we got drenched, and very, very, very strong lightning. Very strong lightning. Good morning, John and Cindy. Good to have the two of you joining us this morning as well. Some of the usual suspects, I might say, are joining us this morning and have checked in. That's great. I know there's a couple others that might be joining us as we go along today, or we'll be joining some other time just because they can't do it live, and that's all right. So today is Thursday. I'll give some announcements and go over some stuff since today is Thursday. It's our last day for this week. It's the first day of our journey through 2 Samuel, but it's the last day of our journey through PB Reads the Bible for this week. We'll start again on Monday. Why? Well, because tomorrow, Friday, is my Sabbath. It's when I take time to rest, refresh, be about creation, and all that kind of stuff. Saturday is my Sue day. I call it my Sue day. I try to keep Saturday as clear as possible, although I usually end up having to finish my sermon and my sermon slides. But I'm going to try to get most of that done today to make sure that I'm free Friday and Saturday. And then, of course, Sunday is worship day. It's kind of hard to be doing this and that at the same time. So anyway, we will get back together Monday morning at 9 o'clock I should have checked my calendar, but I don't think there's anything going on this coming week that's going to interfere. But as far as you're concerned, it's going to be live Monday through Thursday at 9 o'clock. You might have noticed that I don't have one of my typical backgrounds behind me today. I just went with something different, just blurred my background. That's actually the walls of my office. You just can't see the stuff. Only 5 drops of rain you guys got up in Nipa. Extremely dry. Yeah, we were extremely dry until that rain, but it came down so heavy, it's probably just in the Chesapeake by now, and that's about it. So we could probably still use rain, I'm sure. Sorry about that, folks. That's the last of my water. All right. Thursday, but Saturday, Sunday, Sunday. We will be having worship at 8:15 and at 10:45 in person at both of those times. And we'd love to have you join us in person for either of those worship experiences. If you're in the area and if you feel comfortable in coming to be here, we would love to have that. Now, if you don't live nearby, or if you're uncomfortable, or if you're sick, or if you're for whatever reason you can't be with us in person, please join us on the live stream for the 10:45 worship experience that is available on Facebook, YouTube, and our website. Speaking of our website, in probably, I'm hoping, I shouldn't put any dates on that. We've got somebody working on our website to improve it and update it, make it more user-friendly and interactive. And we've got some other stuff planned. I think it's going to be wonderful. So be looking for that. Be looking for that. But in the meantime, still use our website, umcchrist.org, for information about the church, for ways to give should you want to donate to the assist with the finances here at the church. That's fine. You could do it that way. Not that you have to, of course. But there's other things there on the website you might want to check out. But and when the new one gets done and goes live, I'll make sure I mention to you so that you can check it out. But if you're joining us for worship from home or from somewhere else, from somewhere other than here through the live stream on Sunday, I encourage you to create some sort of a sacred space, a cross, candles, the Bible, paper and pen for notes, all that kind of stuff. Just because we want to make sure that you're not a watcher. You're not watching worship, even though you're online. You're not watching worship. You're participating in worship. Worship isn't something we go to. Worship is something we do. So whether we're in person or not, we're still participants in worship, or we should strive to be. And it is week 3 on our series, The Exodus and the Wilderness. And so we'll be looking at the Exodus. You might say the Exodus proper, the big section of the story, the parts that the Ten Commandments movie seems to concentrate on, as do other movies and stories and stuff like that. So it will be not that you're going to hear me read the whole thing, but we're going to be covering like 12 chapters of the book of Exodus in one sermon. So you need to be reading ahead of time. You need to be reading ahead of time. But speaking of reading, let's get to it, shall we? We're going to do 2 Samuel. We're going to begin our journey through 2 Samuel. I'm going to say it again, and I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but this needs to be said. This was originally one book. 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel were originally one document, one book, just called Samuel. In the Hebrew Bibles today, it is still one book. It's just Samuel. Same for Kings and for Chronicles. we have them split up into twos. We being Christian Bibles, Christians, have them split up into twos, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They weren't originally 2 books each. They were originally 1, and they still are in Hebrew Bibles. That's part of the reason for the difference in the number of books of the Bible in the Old Testament. When you're comparing the Old Testament or the Christian Bible with the full Jewish Bible, Hebrew Bible, you're going to have a different number of books. And one of the reasons why is because we split Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles into 2 books each. So instead of being 3, we get 6. So remember that everything we've just been covering, if you've been following along through 1 Samuel, this doesn't pick up at a later time. It's flowing right into it. It's the same author or authors and the same editor or editors putting it together. By splitting into 2 books, we're creating a false division in the story. Okay, so the book is called Samuel. In the original book is called Samuel, and we still call it 1st and 2nd Samuel. But Samuel's dead and gone, and Samuel was center stage for portions of 1st Samuel, but only for portions and only in the beginning. We might think that Saul was, if we're only looking at 1st Samuel and Saul dies, we think, okay, 1st Samuel is about Saul. No, Saul was a main character, and Saul was did occupy center stage for part of the book of 1st Samuel, more of it than Samuel did. 1st Samuel really is David's story. The entire book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the story of David. It is the story of David. He is the main character who occupies center stage the vast majority of the stories and the pages in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Saul and Samuel, although they take center stage from time to time, truly are not the main characters. They're not the stars of the show. They are secondary characters. Cheryl, excuse me, would say, okay, so Cheryl, oh, yep, sun, it is gorgeous sunshine outside. And Marcia says, oops, I'm not sure what that's about, Marcia. I hope everything's okay. Glad you're joining us, though. All right. So they took whoever they was, they of the Greeks and the folks who translated it into Greek and the folks who translated it into Latin, the Septuagint. So this would have been they, and that would have been before, actually still before Jesus. They chose Saul's death to be a good place to split the book, because that's the way books were ended in at the time. A lot of books, both in Scripture and outside of Scripture, were ended, often ended with the main character's death. So we might misunderstand. If we only read 1 Samuel, we might misunderstand and think it's been the story of Saul. It has not. It has been the story of David. Saul just plays a part in it. So that was a spoiler. Perhaps I should have done a spoiler alert. If you didn't read 1 Samuel, Saul died. And that's how 1 Samuel ends, with the Philistines being victorious in that huge battle and taking over Judean territory, and celebrating Saul's death when they find his dead body and hanging his body on a wall along with those of his sons, and the people of Jabesh Gilead remembering Saul's great deeds and how he helped them, and them rushing to where Saul's body was to recover the bodies, take them, burn them, and properly bury them. Go through all that. So what happens next? Because remember, this is the same thing. So we get to 2 Samuel chapter 1. I'm going to read part of it. Part of it is narrative, in narrative form, prose form, and part of it is poetry. So I'm definitely going to stop when we get to that part. All right, continuing. So picking up from there, right? Starting the reading. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Pause. So, and this isn't a new author reminding us of this, of what's going on. It's just the editor or the author just what they were partially doing is making sure that David had no connection to and no guilt in Saul's death. That was important for the editor of the, or editors and authors of these stories. Again and again, they were emphasizing that David had the opportunity. Remember, we've had that opportunity to kill Saul. And he said, no, I'm not going to lift my hand against the Yahweh's anointed. It is supposed that there were people who were anti-Davidic dynasty folks at the time and blamed David for Saul's death and blamed David for other things and didn't like the idea that David became king over Saul's descendants. So that's some of the background and the backdrop to how some of these stories are put together. Okay, that's what we suppose, we think, based on this, and based in great part on how the authors and editors are so emphatic and emphasizing that David had nothing to do with it. And that's what the author is doing here. He's not just reminding us that David of the timeline and how long things have been. He's reminding us that David was nowhere near here, so don't try to blame him for Saul's death. Okay, so just remember back a couple chapters, David returned to Ziklag with his men, found it had been raided by an Amalekite raiding party. He went after them, like a 3-day journey, comes back to Ziklag, spends 2 more days there, and then he finds out about Saul's death. So there's no way he could have been involved in it. That's what the author is telling us at this point. On the third day, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance. David said to him, "Where have you come from?" He said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did things go? Tell me." He answered, "The army fled from the battle, but also many of the army fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died." Then David asked the young man who was reporting to him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan died?" The young man reporting to him, said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, while the chariots and the horsemen drew close to him. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. I answered, 'Here, sir.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' He said to me, 'Come, stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan and for the army of Yahweh and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who had reported to him, "Where do you come from?" He answered, "I am the son of a resident alien, an Amalekite." David said to him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy Yahweh's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Come here and strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed Yahweh's anointed." Pause. Wow, powerful little story, powerful little story. I wanted to read that whole thing, and so that I can go back and explain what was going on. Now, this story somewhat begins the same as the Saul's death story that ended First Samuel, that ended the last chapter. That ended the last chapter, I should say it that way, right? That ended the last chapter. It starts the same. Fierce battle, Mount Gilboa, and the army is fleeing. Saul and his sons are dead. Saul and his sons are dead. All that starts the same. So we're reminded of the last story, and we can start to compare some of the differences. The author didn't mention anyone else being there when Saul died, just Saul and his armor bearer, right? Both of who died because Saul committed suicide, and then the armor bearer committed suicide. But here we've got this story, sounds similar, but we've got some differences right off the bat. I don't remember this guy being there. He must have been at a distance. But then we get to some major differences. When David starts to probe into it, the guy said, "Well, I was there. I was there. And Saul called out to me. And I told him who I was, that I was an Amalekite, but I'm your servant, whatever." And I saw him leaning against his spear while the chariots and the horsemen drew near. So he's painting a picture, and it's not the same picture that we have from chapter 31, from the last chapter. He's painting additional details in here that are starting to conflict with the story as already reported. The Philistines, who may be Amalekites, but the Philistines are drawing near in their chariots and horses. That's different. But I saw him, and he was leaning against his spear. A brief aside to talk about the spear. How many times have we heard this thing mentioned, right? That's an important spear, one that Saul was seen with as he was pondering things under his tree. He threw it at David at least once, if not twice. He threw it at his son Jonathan. David stole it from his campsite to prove that he could have killed him if he had wanted to. And here he is seen leaning against his spear, holding it almost as a cane or a prop to keep him up. And the guy says, when Saul saw me, I told him who I was, that I was an Amalekite, and he told me to come kill him. And so I did. And so I've brought you his crown and his armlet. So this is very different now from the story as told previously. Why? Because a different author must be telling a different story. No. And that is one possibility. But the more likely possibility, the more agreed upon possibility, is that this guy made the story up. Because when we look at everything he's done, he's thinking he's going to be rewarded. If he knew that Saul, and he knew that those were his sons, he should have also known that it wasn't all of Saul's sons. And he should have taken the crown and the armlet back to the Philistines, back to the Amalekites, or given it back to somebody in Israel so that one of Saul's descendants can take it. But no, he goes and finds David. He's thinking that by bringing this good news, that David's going to want to hear that Saul is dead, and I'm giving him these signs of authority. I'm giving him what he needs to rule, the crown and the armlet. He's going to reward me. He's going to be so happy. He's going to reward me. That's what's built into this story. And that's probably because also because people thought that David was probably happy when Saul died. And so the author and the editors need to show David does not celebrate Saul's death. What happens? David and his men immediately grieve over Saul's death. And it is a profound grief. They do all the things you're supposed to do, the tearing of clothes, weeping, fasting until they can no longer weep, right? That's how his reaction is described. It's the exact opposite of what this guy, this Amalekite, this slave, thought David would react. And it's the exact opposite of how David was being accused of acting. And so the author and the editors are pointing this out. David did not celebrate. David mourned when Saul died. Okay, so that's why this is here. Now, another thing about this, notice how this all takes place, right? We have this guy coming, dirty and clothes torn, and he's coming and approaching, and he gets to David and he falls before him. And he relates the story with some probing questions by the person. So we've got a messenger and we've got the person receiving the message, and they have a dialogue, and it is through the probing questions of the messengee that the messenger relates the information. There should be an echo to what took place back in chapter 4 or 5, when the messenger who fled from the battle that Israel lost, there was another devastating battle with the horrible news that the ark had been captured and that Eli's sons had been killed. And he comes and he gives the message to Eli, and it happens in a similar fashion. Excuse me, I want to turn my phone off. I turned my phone off for a moment. And also that phone. Sorry about that, Gwen. I'll have to call that person back. Where was I? So we had a similar situation back then with that messenger coming to give that information to Eli and falling down before him. And it is through that conversation that the whole message comes out. So this is like an echo. It's being told in a very similar fashion. Now, after David and his soldiers weep and fast, the servant is still there, and he figures, okay, now David, because David comes back to him and addresses him again. Who are you again? Like he forgot who this guy was or where he was from, kind of thing. Tell me your stuff. Where do you come from? Where do you come from? And the guy thinks, okay, great. Now I'm going to receive my reward. And David immediately says, excuse me, after he says again, yeah, I'm an Amalekite, the son of a resident alien. David says, were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy Yahweh's anointed? Keeps coming back to that, doesn't it, folks? Keeps coming back to that. And again, author, editor, to emphasize the fact that David had nothing to do with Saul's death and would never have anything to do with Saul's death. He keeps coming back to that thought, that phrase about the Lord's anointed. I would never harm the Lord's anointed, Yahweh's anointed. You weren't afraid to do that? You should have been, because now you're going to die. Your own tongue, your own lips have condemned you with this confession. And he exacts immediate punishment for he declares him guilty and has him executed on the spot. There's no delay. So that's what that all has to do with, that idea of the Lord's anointed, and you should have been afraid to do it. You should have been afraid to do it. So that ends the the narrative portion, the prose portion of chapter 1. Now we get into a beautiful piece of poetry. This is a particular kind of poetry. It's not a lament. Hebrew poetry and the Psalms in particular usually fall into a few different types of category. Psalm of praise, and a psalm of lament. Psalm of lament. Sometimes there's a psalm that would actually be both, and it goes from lament to praise. Walter Brueggemann refers to them as psalms of orientation and psalms of reorientation. Psalms of reorientation. This really isn't a psalm of lament. What would be the difference? Well, a psalm of lament is directed towards God. God is actually not mentioned at all in this poem. This falls into the category of well, I don't know what I don't know the Hebrew word kina or something like that, but it's a dirge. We might also think of it as a eulogy. It is a very, very sad one. See, a lament describes pain and sorrow and grief, but also usually has like a call to action kind of thing involved in it, a request of God. That's not what this is. This is merely describing, eulogizing someone who has died and describing the person, the grief that should be attached to it. It's a dirge. It's a dirge. So we're going to read it. There are like 2 verses of prose that start it, but that's just to start things off. We could think of these as the opening lines as a superscription, which would be directions on how what you were supposed to do with the poem. David intoned this lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan. He ordered that the song of the bow be taught to the people of Judah. It is written in the book of Jashar. Pause. There's differences of agreement of exactly how to translate that or what that whole thing means. But many believe that the Song of the Bow should be read as the title of this following poem. However, it can be read in a couple different ways, but that's the one that makes the most sense. So that's one we're going to go with here. And the book of Jashar is mentioned elsewhere, but we don't, as far as I know, no one has ever found it. No one has ever found it. And he said, David being the he said, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul anointed with oil no more. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." End of chapter 1. So now we're going to go back and I'm going to talk about this. I didn't want to interrupt that poem. So this is poetry. This is Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is complex, and I don't understand the whole thing and all the nuances of it. And even what I do understand, we don't have time to go through it all. But just to highlight a couple things, if you've never had much experience with it, Hebrew poetry quite often uses something called parallelism, where lines, generally succeeding lines, support each other, have a relationship to each other in some way. Sometimes by through synonymous Synonymic, meaning telling the same thing either in the same words or very similar words, using similar words. Antithetic, meaning saying one thing and then supporting it and saying but, and then listing its opposite. Or sometimes it's a false relationship, just kind of put together. It's like a synthetic relationship, I believe is what they call that. And usually, or quite often, it's in verses and lines of text right before and after each other. But sometimes they're separated, or sometimes there's two that are together, and then these two have a relationship. And actually, you end up seeing that these two and these two have a relationship to each other. So it can be quite complex. We're not going to get into all of that. But these are kind of important things to know when you're reading Hebrew poetry, because it starts to explain some things and opens things up in a different way. And I'm going to point out a few of those as we go along through here. So, your glory, O Israel. In the past, we said that glory, especially early on, was actually referring to God, to Yahweh, that God was Israel's glory. This word translated glory is a different word, so it does not mean that. This would just mean the renown of Israel, the might of Israel has fallen. Okay, your glory, O Israel. And you can see here, lie slain upon your high places, how the mighty have fallen. So we've got glory and mighty. There's the parallelism. Lie slain, have fallen. So we can see the parallelism. I'm not going to do this with each one, just to help point them out for you for this passage and for the future. And here in particular, so this section of the poem is speaking to all of Israel, and your glory, your mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen. Specifically, David and Jonathan, although we can also include in there the entire Israelite army, which was defeated, fled, killed, and all that kind of stuff. So he's probably talking about that. And David says, tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not, you saw that, right? In the streets of Ashkelon, right? So don't tell Gath, don't tell Ashkelon, don't tell the people in the Philistines. We already know that they know, right? Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, the daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. Quite easy to see the parallelism there. So his wish, he may or may not know that the Philistia knows that Saul's dead. He probably knows, or at the very least assumes, that by now, since it's been several days, that the people in Gath and Ashkelon, et cetera, have heard. And we know from chapter 31 that they are celebrating and that they've spread all this information around. But he is wishing. This is a wish. Oh, that they didn't know, kind of thing. Or else they're going to celebrate, which they are. And he refers to the Philistines as uncircumcised. And not just physical, but like we might almost say spiritual. It's an epithet. It's a derogatory epithet. It's a derogatory term for someone. Which David has used before. He used it when he was talking with Goliath. And excuse me, Saul also used it. And he said, kill me before the uncircumcised get here. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dews or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. He's talking, Mount Gilboa is the place where the battle, where Saul died, Saul and Jonathan, we should emphasize that, died. He is proclaiming a curse upon it. Let no rain, let nothing fall upon you. Let no rain fall upon you. Let there be no dew collect on you, and let nothing grow on you, because you should be a land of death because of the death that has taken place there. For there, the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, anointed with oil no more. So this is specifically about Saul's death, and referring to Saul as a shield, and also speaking of his shield, being anointed with oil no more. You would oil your shield before you went into battle. Many of the shields were leather covered, so you would want to oil the leather, help protect it, and keep them strong, and usable. But also, there's the double meaning, reminding us that Saul was anointed, and he was Israel's shield. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty. Blood and fat, fat can also be, I don't know if it could actually be translated as flesh, but we can think of it as flesh. So and the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. David is proclaiming their valiance, how strong they were, how valiantly they fought, and like every shot from Jonathan's bow took a life, or and every swipe of Saul's sword drew blood. There were no misses by either of them. So he's speaking of their abilities as warriors. And might be a little bit of a stretch, but not much of a stretch. Those words, blood and fat, often have sacrificial meanings. We think of the temple sacrifices that have taken place in the sanctuary previously, and the tabernacle previously, and eventually will take place in the temple, often involve blood and fat, right? They pour the blood out and you burn up the fat prior to eating it and stuff like that. So we could see in this, maybe a slight stretch of it, that Saul and Jonathan were performing sacrifices as they were killing the Philistines, as they were killing their enemies. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, and that word lovely has more to do with their character than their physical appearance, the real Hebrew. In fact, the NIV translates it as gracious, which is also accurate. It's not that lovely is not accurate, but when we hear the word lovely, we might think physical appearance. So they were handsome men. That's not what David was trying to say about them. It was their character. So this is a eulogy, especially at this part. He's speaking, and you do not speak. Most people don't speak bad about someone at a eulogy as you're remembering things. So David is not saying anything bad about them. He's speaking about how gracious they were, including Saul. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. So he's going on and on about how great they were. And they were not divided. In life and in death, they were not divided. Now, we might think back to some of the stories and they were divided. Well, yes and no. They had their arguments and they were divided over their response to David. But Jonathan never left Saul. He could have left with David and joined David's troops. He chose not to. He stayed with his father Saul. And here in the final battle, he is with his father Saul. So they were divided over some issues, mostly over David, we might say, but they were still together in life and in death. Now, earlier, verse 20b, he talks about the Philistine women, the daughters of the Philistines, the daughters of the uncircumcised will rejoice and will exult. Here in 24, we see the opposite of that. Oh, daughters of Israel, and weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. So we see, what was he saying here? He's reminding that he was calling for. Earlier, he was hoping and wishing and that they wouldn't know. The Philistines wouldn't know, because then the women will celebrate, which they did. Now here he's calling for the women of Israel to mourn, to weep. This is the proper response to the death of Saul and Jonathan. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. We see that phrase, how the mighty have fallen. This is the second time that David has used this. He used it in the second half of verse 19, which was the first verse of the poem proper, how the mighty have fallen. He uses it again here, and he uses it again at a third place, at the very end in verse 27, how the mighty have fallen. So the first time he uses it is almost like the introduction. It's the it's the second part of the first verse of the poem, but it's right there at the beginning. This one here, and then one at the end. Obviously, the one at the end is just to sum things up. This one here, scholars say we could read this as it divides the poem into two unequal parts, because here he changes his major focus. The first unequal part, the first part of this poem is about Israel's army. It's about Saul and Jonathan. And it's mostly, if you had to pick one, it's mostly about Saul. The last section, this part 2 of the poem, which is only a couple verses long, is solely about Jonathan. The other difference between the two parts, the first part is about Israel's grief over Saul and Jonathan. That's even a better way to describe it. It's Israel's response of grief, and it's this public grief of how we should all be grieving right now. In this last part, David turns his focus only to Jonathan and only to his personal grief. That's the major difference. I should have phrased it that way, between part 1 and part 2, the public grief and the personal grief. He says, Jonathan lies slain upon the high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, which we can read that in a couple different ways, that my brother, almost literal, because David was technically married to Jonathan's sister, Michal, but also brothers because they had that covenant relationship, and partners in a covenant often considered themselves or use the expression brother in it. So it's we can look at that word in a couple different ways. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. That's an interesting, and how the mighty have fallen. In this case, it's strictly Jonathan, and the weapons of war perished. Which actually, at that point, we could see Saul and Jonathan being the weapons of war, and that they perished. But back to that line, your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Some folks, there are folks that point to this passage. There are some theologians and some scholars, Bible scholars, that point to this passage as an indication of something more than just friendship, as a hint at homosexual relationship between Jonathan and David, that they were homosexual. There's nothing in the text. There's nothing in the wording or the syntax to explicitly confirm or deny that prospect. Okay. So there's nothing there that says, oh yeah, they were definitely gay, but there's also nothing in there that says, no, you're absolutely wrong. That's not what it means. It can mean that, but it also doesn't have to mean that. So let's kind of live in the ambiguity of that. Let's live in the ambiguity of that. One of the commentators that I've been using says this about this. Because we also know, and if we don't know yet, this is going to be a spoiler alert for you. David has many liaisons with women. Okay, he's already got several wives. He's going to have more. He's also going to have other things. One of which, of course, is extremely famous and notorious, and that is his relationship with Bathsheba. We should be alert to the possibility, this is what the commentator says, we should be alert to the possibility that this phrase says less about David's sexual orientation than it says about the status of women in ancient Israel. Okay, he goes on to say, in an era of arranged marriages, love was not considered the basis of most relationships between men and women. Liaisons with women existed either in the context of marriage, where the purpose was childbearing, or in illicit contexts where the purpose was to satisfy lust. Love of women in such limited contexts might indeed pale in comparison to the deep and personal commitment represented by the love of David and Jonathan for each other. That was interesting. I'd never read that before, so I wanted to share that one with you. Okay, so you can look at it a couple different ways. Maybe yes, maybe no, and maybe something else as well, or maybe some combination of 2 or 3 of those things. Anyway, my friends, that's going to be it for today, right? Just the one chapter, but 950, that was a lot to talk about, I guess. Sorry to keep you here so long. I do pray that it was beneficial to you and that you learned something or relearned something today, that God spoke to you in some way. As you go about your days, not just today, but every day, keep those eyes and ears, physical and spiritual, open to everything that our living, loving, active God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. When you see it, when you hear it, say, thank you, Papa, and then tell somebody. Okay. Until we meet again, my friends, be blessed. Be blessed. Bye.